So, you know what? I start out every video with the word so. Have you noticed that? Oh well. So anyway, I thought I would start a series where once a week, maybe twice a week, I will talk about a different instrument and talk about its history, its use, why it exists, why it went out of favor. And I thought I'd start off this episode talking about a more unusual member of the saxophone family. And we're going to focus today on the C Melody Saxophone. Properly, it's called a C Tenor saxophone. And the reason it got called a C Melody, remember C Melody is a nickname, is that because it's pitched in the key of C, it could play along with the melodies on the piano. And so let's go back and start all the way at the beginning of the story with Adolphe Sax. And the idea that Adolphe Sax created two families of saxophones. One pitched in B flat and E flat, the so-called band saxophones, because those were common band keys, and the other set in C and in F. Well, this story has been told for years and years and years. It's been replicated in books all over, and it may not be fully true. Not true? Well, here's the real story. Sax's original patent on the saxophone said that, yeah, these instruments could be made in, so say we take our tenor sax in B flat, or in this case, C. And he said this for all the instruments in the original patent. However, by the time he got to manufacturing the instruments, that really wasn't the case. A lot of the instruments never got made. Baritone saxophone in F never got made. Sopranino saxophone in F never got made. In fact, only 4 sizes of C and F instruments got made. One is the bass saxophone in C, the very first instrument Sax made, and he never made another one. There are a handful of tenor saxophones in C, just like this one, and then altos in F and sopranos in C, and no others. And those total maybe about 20 instruments that are still around. And that's it. He didn't really create a second family. Where the idea of the second family comes about starts with a orchestration text by Kastner. Kastner was the first person to ever write for the saxophone. He scored for it in an oratorio called The Last King of Judah. And in that he called for bass saxophone for the very first time. He wrote several treatises on how to score for the military band. And in the first edition of his treatise, he talked about the two families. However, by the second and third editions, he got rid of that because Adolphe Sax himself had gotten rid of that idea too. However, one influential person read that, and that was Hector Berlioz. Berlioz took that idea that from Kastner, that there are two families, the orchestral and the band, and ran with it. Well, guess who read Berlioz's treatise? Everybody. And so the idea that there were two families of saxophones, one orchestral and one band, perpetuated. And so we get to composers like Richard Strauss in his Symphonia Domestica, where he scores for all F and C instruments. We get to Bolero, where he scores for an F sopranino, thinking that's the orchestral instrument. But the actuality is, a couple instruments existed, but not many. So let's fast forward to about 1900. The only one of the F and C instruments that makes it with any success is the tenor saxophone in C, the C Melody. There are several manufacturers who keep making that instrument. I personally had an Yvette and Schaefer apogee system C Tenor from about 1899, and it is the only instrument that I no longer have in my collection that I kick myself for having sold because it was such a cool saxophone. But because that instrument survived, other manufacturers started taking it up. And throughout the 1910s, the 1920s, it gets to be one of the most popular sizes of saxophone made, for home use in particular. Why is it popular at home? Well, because you don't have records that you can go play. You don't have a radio you can go listen to. So if you want to hear music, you have a piano, and someone is going to sit there at the piano and play the popular tunes of the day. Well, you want somebody else to play along? Okay, great. You're not going to transpose it. You got to have an instrument that will be able to read the music. And so the C tenor. Easy enough. Now, there is another C instrument. It is the soprano in C, and I've done a video on that instrument. Go check it out. But the difference is, soprano sax is harder to play than tenor sax. And the smaller size you get, well, the more difficult it is. So C soprano, well, yeah, it's going to read the same pitches, but it is a more difficult instrument to play. Not so with the C tenor. It's pretty easy to play. It's a little bit bigger than the alto. It's a little bit smaller than the B-flat tenor. It's a perfect size. It happened to also be the favorite size of a couple of musicians who were really popular at the time. Frankie Trumbauer and Rudy Wiedoff. And I've got a Rudy Wiedoff piece queued up right here, and I'm going to just play a little bit of it. So Wiedoff was a really noted saxophone player of the 1910s and early 1920s, and his primary instrument of choice was the C Melody, the C tenor. And so what I've got here is I'm going to try and butcher my way through a little bit of Valse Erica. Not perfect. I'm still learning it. I think I'm going to do a recital lecture series on the history of the saxophone and include that in there. And so I'll be working on it. Plus, it's on like a really tiny screen that I can barely see. But anyway, so in the early days of what would become jazz, some of the players were using this pretty extensively in vaudeville circuits and whatnot. There were two styles of C tenors being manufactured, and they were being manufactured mostly in the United States at this point. So this style here, we have a straight neck. This was manufactured largely by the C.G. Kahn company. So Kahn would have a straight alto-like neck. Well, the other saxophone makers of the time, including Bisher and Martin and Holton, and Wiedoff played on Holton instruments, would use a curved neck that made it look like a small tenor. So about like that. And this particular instrument happens to have both. In fact, this instrument I'm using is a Chinese, I can't even say clone because it is not really a clone of anything. It is a modern C tenor saxophone, keyed all the way up to high F sharp. It's got all the bells and whistles you'd want on a modern saxophone, but it's a C tenor. It's actually based on the bore design of the later C.G. Kahn instruments. And this particular instrument works best with the straight neck. And it's also the most comfortable to play. If you are looking for an older instrument, always be on the lookout for the CG Con instruments with the straight neck. Now, of course, one of the things that started to kill off the C Tenor saxophone, the C Melody Saxophone, was the Great Depression. And with the Great Depression, well, people just didn't have spending money. And if you don't know this, in the 1920s, there was a saxophone craze. And that's a lot of times what it gets called. The most popular instrument in the United States for the entire decade of the 1920s was the saxophone, with hundreds of thousands of instruments being produced. And one of the most popular of those was the C Melody. In fact, to this day, because of the number of C melodies produced in the 1920s, after the soprano, alto, B-flat, tenor, and baritone, the most commonly encountered size of saxophone is the C tenor. These instruments were made up until the early 1950s. In fact, we have a few instruments made by Selmer. There is, believe it or not, a couple of Selmer Mark VI C tenor saxophones, C Melody saxophones. They are very rare, and good luck getting your hands on them. The one I know in existence is a museum piece. I believe Sax Quest in St. Louis has that. There's a couple videos of them. And there's also a Selmer Balanced Action from slightly before that. So they made them. So they're really pretty much dead by 1940. Now, musicians have these instruments available because they were made in such large numbers. But one of the problems is, yeah, you can get them fixed up, but you're never going to use them. You can buy a cheap C Melody Sax for couple $100, but getting it fixed up and into playing condition is going to cost more than the instrument's worth. So most of the time, the musicians are not going to put in the money to fix them up, which is a shame because they're really pretty cool instruments. The other thing is the mouthpiece. This is a C Melody mouthpiece here. This is a modern mouthpiece. This is actually made by Caravan, and it may be the absolute best mouthpiece I have on any of my saxophones, sopranino through baritone, and I absolutely love this mouthpiece. It is the most free-blowing and easy-playing mouthpiece I have, and it's one of the recommended mouthpieces I will give for C tenor if you don't have an original C Melody mouthpiece. Those often got lost, and by and large, you couldn't use a B-flat tenor mouthpiece or an alto mouthpiece on them, though some people have had some success. It's not as optimal as using an actual mouthpiece. So let's say you get one of these horns and get it fixed up. What are you going to use it on? And the answer is not a lot. You could do some solo recital stuff. If you want to take it to a jazz gig and you have say you have a real book in C. You don't have your B-flat real book. Well, take along your C Melody Sax. What about composers, though? Could composers start using this? And I would say absolutely composers can start really looking at this as a viable sound because they are fairly readily available. I would say, a saxophone player could easily get their hands on one. I've got this one, and I'm not a great saxophone player by any means. I'm much more of a composer nowadays than I am a performer. And so, what could we do compositionally with the C Melody saxophone? Well, couple things. One, this could be our second alto. Why not? It will take the lower part. It's only a minor third below where the regular E-flat alto sits, and it could cover those parts. Or say you want two altos, and then this is now your third part. Alto, alto, C Melody. And it's going to sit above the B-flat tenor, so you got alto, alto, C Melody, B flat tenor. Why not? Or say you have a jazz band setting. Jazz bands have two tenor saxophones, first tenor, second tenor. We'll put this on first tenor. Now you've got first tenor in C, second tenor in B flat. That would be an interesting idea to work with. I've included C tenor saxophone in two of my pieces, both Symphonies 2 and 3. Those are very large scale works. Each has a section of 8 saxophones. And the general setup is 2 altos, C tenor, B flat tenor, as well as, it depends on the situation, what's on the other side. It could be soprano, sopranino, or on the upper end, or just one soprano, and then on the lower end, baritone bass, or 2 baritones and a bass. So it just depends on how the symphony's working at that moment. Lots of doubling. But I use it as a solo voice. I use it as first tenor. I use it as third alto. I find it to be a very versatile voice as a composer. Should composers be using it? If you know you have an instrument available, I see absolutely no reason to not use it. It's a fantastic sound. It is very distinctive from either the alto or the tenor. It's a light sound. Tell you what, I'll just go ahead and play a B flat scale, 2.5 octaves, low B flat to high F, give you an idea of just the overall timbre of the C tenor. So it's not quite tenor-like, it's not quite alto-like, it's its own voice. And man, I think for my money, this is a great middle range solo voice. I'd love to see it used more. Outside of pieces like the Wiedoff I played earlier, there's not really a lot of literature for it. Orchestrally, I don't really know of any pieces that call for C tenor. Oddly, the big piece that uses C saxophones is Strauss's Sinfonia Domestica, which uses C soprano, F alto, F baritone, and C bass. And the most common of the F and C instruments around, the C tenor, is absent. It may also be used, and I'll have to check on the score to this, John Alden Carpenter's Skyscrapers, which is an unusual American orchestral work, kind of in the same vein as some of the orchestral stuff that George Gershwin was doing in the 1920s, and he uses quite a few of the odd saxophones in that piece, and I believe there's a C tenor saxophone in there, as well as some of the other saxophones. But don't quote me on that, I'd have to check my sources. Otherwise, the C tenor saxophone, the C Melody Saxophone, an interesting voice within the saxophone family. Let me know down in the comments below, what are your experiences with the C tenor saxophone? And as always, like, comment, subscribe, and let me know if you want me to keep doing instrument profiles like this. I think it could be something kind of fun to do, like once a week, maybe twice a week even. It would just focus on one instrument. And so, anyway, that's the story of the C Melody or C tenor saxophone.